Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. We'll just wait a few minutes, or not a few minutes, a few seconds for people to join. While you're waiting, my name's Andrew Henderson, one of the consultants at Speeki. For those who don't know us, we are a sustainability management system provider, as well as assurance and training and technology provider. So that's a bit about us. Just give it a little bit more time. I can see some people still coming in. Okay, and just some housekeeping. This session is being recorded, so copies will be available after the event if you want to listen to it or pass it on to other people. And also for anyone who couldn't attend, obviously, they can also be provided with that. We will probably have time for questions at the end, so please put some questions in the question box if you want me to answer things. If we run out of time for questions, I'll get to answering questions over email if that requires it, or can have a chat. I'm certainly open to any discussions about this topic. So the topic itself is very much looking at pitfalls that we've seen in our work as assurance providers around ESG reports, so auditing and assurance of ESG reports. So we think this is going to be a major topic for many companies, especially in Europe with the CSRD, obviously, but really worldwide. So more and more countries are requiring both reporting on sustainability matters and assurance of that reporting. Now, obviously, every country is making its own decisions outside of Europe, but we're seeing more and more movement towards specific reporting requirements, whether that's very broad in scope, like the SRS, more narrow in scope, or focused on like the IFRS sort of family of reports. But each one of those is pretty much all had some kind of at least limited assurance requirement. So we think this is going to be very important, but we also know that reporting is new for many companies, if not most. Reporting has been around for companies. Obviously, there have been European companies under the non-financial reporting directive for many years, if they were very large. There have been some voluntary reporting provided by companies under GRI and various other schemes. But for the majority of companies, and certainly the ones we're talking to of a sort of tier down from the NFRD type of companies, this is all very new to them. So both the requirement to report out on sustainability matters, but also the requirement to get at least limited assurance for now. What we're trying to do today is really talk through some of the issues we found. Every company will have their own specific set of issues in how they deal with the assurance requirement. But what we're trying to do is look back at some of the work that we've done and find some of the areas that we've had issues on that are common across a number of clients. Okay, the first issue that we see is not enough time is given to assurance. That maybe has been slightly alleviated by the omnibus stop the clock directive, in that people now have a couple more years, those that haven't had to previously disclose, like the NFRD cohort. But we still see that assurance is like a end of process kind of point. Companies are rushing. We've seen that certainly last year when people were getting prepared for it. The way that they would put timelines together didn't leave time, in our opinion, didn't really leave time for a proper assurance process to be done. And that's actually probably more important now when people are starting to learn, because assurance is your feedback mechanism. It's the way that you learn to get better for next year. It's not, it should be more than just the rubber stamp to say, yes, you're good to publish. Assurance is going to be necessary. It's going to be necessary all the time. And it needs to be thought of as part of a continuous process rather than a one-off at the end of the year. And we talk to clients about this all the time. There are parts of, for example, CSRD reporting that get done early in their cycle, and there are parts that get done late in the cycle. So things like your materiality assessment, that gets done at the beginning. That stakeholder engagement is part of that process. Setting up governance, all of those things can be assured early on in the process, but it can't be. It shouldn't be done right at the end. So assurance should really start thinking about a calendar of items. When can they be done, and not leaving everything at the end. It can't be done in that way. There's just not enough time in a calendar year to both gather the data, assure the data, and then publish the report. You'll be in a constant state of catching up with yourself. So you really need to think about the items as you go through and say which are the items that need to be done early and which are the ones that can only be done right at the end. So getting yourself into that sort of idea of a calendar is essential. The next thing we find is just consistency. Now, obviously, something as broad as ESRS covers so many topics across so many parts of the business. What we find is that a lot of companies that even those that did have teams looking at various ESG topics in the past, they had them very much in silos. So the environmental team would really just be looking at carbon emissions. The social team, the DEI team, as part of HR, would be looking at a couple of social metrics. But what that's meant is that they didn't talk the same language. They didn't really have the same way of thinking about the information that they were gathering, or the way they were going to analyze it, or the end result that has to go into some kind of report. And as an assurance provider, you're looking across a lot of different topics, a lot of different ways. And we often find that people just don't talk the same language. They don't really understand the broader picture. They stay in their little silos and not really get the sense. Well, we don't really get the sense that they really know that there's one company policy, there's one set of ways of doing things, there's one risk management process. They're still very much siloed. So that's what we find. And we sort of consider it as it's a lack of consistency, a lack of knowledge or consistent knowledge across the various parts of the business. They make it very difficult for an assurance provider to get a clear message or to get a confidence that the governance is in place, confidence that people are aware of the same issues and challenges. And often that is a lack of training. That tends to be the root cause of a lot of this, is that we're not seeing consistent training, both at an awareness level of these are the topics, these are our policies as a company, but also at the more operational side, the data gathering, what are the things they need to do, and what's the end result. So giving people training around those type of topics. That's more diving into the root causes, but one of the big areas we see is a lack of consistency, which makes the assurance role far more difficult. The next area which we see is almost a lack of understanding that there can be multiple providers of assurance. We've certainly had this conversation many times where there's an idea that for example, CSRD assurance needs to cover everything at all points. And that's very much not the case. The standards that we use, like the ISSA 5000 standard, is very clear that there's an expectation or an understanding that other providers will have provided some elements of assurance. And one area that we find that quite regularly is things like greenhouse gas protocol. So the GHG emissions inventories have been created for many years, well before any reporting requirements, either because they had internal requirements or there were some local reporting needs or investors wanted to know. And GHG protocol has its own requirement for some assurance. So quite often we'll come to a company and there will have been some assurance done on a specific topic like the carbon emissions. We're, as providers of the overall assurance for the report, we're quite entitled to use that and not dig into it any deeper, as long as it can meet certain criteria. So the first thing is we need to make sure that the scope of whatever work was done aligns with the scope that we're trying to assure against. That might be to do with business units, that might be to do with countries, geographies, it might be depths. So sometimes you might have done the scope 1 and 2, but actually for the reporting we also need scope 3. So that's something, the first thing we do is make sure that any work that had been previously done is at least as much as we need to assure. Now, obviously, if it's not covering the same countries, the methodology might be enough for us to say, okay, we understand, there wasn't necessarily a full alignment, but as long as everyone's using the same methodology and the assurance has checked that methodology and it works and it's appropriate, we can still use parts at least of that report. So the scope needs to be aligned. It needs to be against some kind of standard that we can understand. We don't need to be experts in that standard. We just need to know that it is a standard and it was assured against a standard. Now, obviously, GHG protocol is quite simple, but there's plenty of other topics within the broad range of ESRS where that may be not as simple because there's lots of different standards that you could choose from. So you just need to be clear about what you've chosen and why you've chosen it, and then the assurance needs to be provided against that standard. The next thing is probably more problematic, and that's we would need to have confidence that the provider was competent. And there's lots of different ways you can look at competence. You can look at the provider's background, so the individual consultant, who were they, what do they do, how well are they trained, how many different projects have they done. But that can require some work. The other part of it is we need to make sure that the provider is working on, the provider themselves, so the company is working under some kind of appropriate standard or accreditation. And that actually solves the competency piece as well. So for the non-statutory financial accounting, there's the IAF, the International Accreditation Forum, and they provide the overarching accreditation that we use. So if you're in the UK, you've got UCAS. If you're in the US, you've got ANAB. So there's country bodies that provide accreditation. And therefore, if we see that the provider that has been used for, again, the greenhouse gas protocol works under one of these accreditation bodies, we don't actually need to worry too much about the competency anymore, because we know that that provider will need to have a code of conduct. They'll need to have a training regime. They'll need to have a competency regime, and they'll have been audited by their accreditation provider. So we don't need to worry about any of those topics. We can be trusting the fact that they're accredited by a partner that we know and trust. And it doesn't have to be IAF. Obviously, there's the financial auditing standards that have a similar kind of structure in place. But whoever it is, you just need to think about from an insurance provider coming in and looking at it, how easy will it be for them to get confidence about the work that's already been done? Because if we're not confident, we either need to dig into the competency and actually see records of training and things like that, or we'll probably just have to do the work again, which is in no one's interests. So when you're doing, getting assurance done in parts, either because it's part of a calendar that you're doing or you've already got a provider that you're very happy with, just make sure that they have the accreditation that your assurance provider can then use. Another area that we find significant challenges with is the involvement of the audit committee, or sustainability and audit committee, however it's named in the company. We find that they are quite slow to change. Traditionally, they've been a financial audit committee. That's where they've come from. But non-financial auditing is very different from financial, mainly because the skill set is different, but the topics also are different. Yeah, a financial auditor, or sorry, financial committee member probably has a CPA, probably has done some audit in their past, or at least a number of members of that committee have. So they kind of know what they're looking for. They might not be the experts in every part of finance. tax or revenue recognition or whatever it is, but they understand the process. Whereas for non-financial sustainability kind of work, they're not experts. So they need to become experts. And that's where we find a lot of struggle at the moment. Because they're not experts, they're not really engaged. They're not driving the audits as they might do for a financial audit because they really understand what they're after. So they might know or be told that they need to do a sustainability or an ESG audit or a CSRD report audit, but they can't really drive it because they don't really know what they're wanting. And that's a challenge when we're getting involved, because often the audit committee is a key element of the work that we're getting. They tell us a lot of information. They tell us what they've seen. They tell us where the issues are. But if they're not engaged, it really means that you struggle to get that kind of information. So it's really a question of training and experience in audit committees, getting the right people at the right levels who understand the breadth. They don't need to be experts in everything, but they need to know enough about sustainability and the topics underneath that to be able to really drive the engagement with the assurance provider, because the assurance is really going to them. That's typically the model. The audit committee drives the assurance model, the assurance efforts. They get the assurance that they need, and then the board or the CEO signs off on the accounts. It's the same thing. So they need to be really heavily involved, but they need better knowledge of the process and the underlying topics. The next area is technology. We see a lot of people that are starting out on the sustainability journey without a management system. We don't sort of see that's a long-term viable proposition. We say this all the time. Your CFO could run his company or her company on Excel. That's a possibility, but I don't think any of them would be particularly excited about that prospect because it's just inefficient. It doesn't do the job in the way that they now expect it to be done. Same with sustainability. There are systems out there. We provide systems that make your life or the life of the sustainability team much easier, but it equally makes the assurance project much easier. Because when we're talking to people about the time and effort of an assurance project, it's more the below the line costs that sometimes is the issue. So it's not the costs of us coming in and doing the work, it's the costs of the company itself, finding the material, getting the people that need to be interviewed. All of that needs to be done. And so the more that is on a system, the easier and the cheaper it becomes for the company, and equally for the provider. If we're coming in and everything's in one place and we're just going through the documents, our life is a lot easier. It might not cut down the overall man days because a lot of that's mandated. But certainly the work that we're doing, we can spend more time on high value work rather than sort of legwork of finding documents, etc. So we think that's a no-brainer. We think everyone needs to start thinking about a management system for this work because it's not going away. This is just part of your future business. It's not something that's here, regardless of what happens with the CSRD, regardless of what happens around the world. Sustainability is here to stay, we think. And to manage sustainability, you need some kind of a management system to manage the documents and manage the metrics and just to put it all together so everyone knows what needs to be done. Okay, so those are the 5 things that we think are the most common pitfalls that we've seen. In closing, really, we think assurance should be seen as a driver of value. It's giving feedback on the overall process. It shouldn't be seen as a rubber stamp. It shouldn't be seen thrown in at the end and squeezed in time just so you can get the reporting done. It should be seen as a way of looking at whether, driven by the audit committee, as to whether the processes and procedures are in place and actually doing the job that need to be done. So planning is everything. If you're comparing it to the financial world, you really need to spend more time. Mainly because the financial world is far more mature, controls are in place, systems are in place. In the non-financial world, the sustainability world, they're just not there. So you need to plan it, but it probably needs more time. Okay, so in closing now, what are the 5 things that you should do? If nothing else from this session, what are the 5 things? First thing, start with the audit committee. Make sure they're skilled. Make sure they know what they're doing. You can test their skills. You can give them quizzes. You can find out what they know, what they don't know. Once they're skilled, make sure they're actually engaged. Make sure they're driving the assurance processes, not just receiving the report at the end. So they really need to be in the driving seat. That should be the first thing you're doing as part of your governance model, making sure the audit committee, however you want to call the audit committee, whether it's sustainability or audit committee, make sure they're driving it and they're skilled and competent people who know what they need. And that 99% of the time, that's either hiring people or more commonly just training people, spending a lot of time training them on what they need to know, because there's a huge amount they need to know. If you think about a senior audit committee member, will have probably had 30, 40 years of finance background. You now have to cram a non-financial kind of knowledge into their head. That's not going to take 6 months. It's not going to take a couple of e-learning courses. It's a lot of training is needed to get them to the same level on these other topics. Secondly, the consistency topic. That's all about a consistent set of language, and it really comes down to training. It's a consistent set of training and messaging across the business. So everyone understands why they're doing it. They understand the policies. They understand the strategy around sustainability. And you start changing culture and behavior to get that commonality. Because often the lack of commonality is really just a sign that there isn't a common culture or a common understanding. And it's breaking down those silos. It's not to say people aren't doing their good job. It doesn't say that they're not working competently. But over time, you need to break down those silos so you can have a common message and a common way of working. Next thing is the plan for standards. So making sure that you're aware, not just the standards that you're using for assurance. Obviously, the CSRD assurance has got its own standard, the various versions of the ISSA 5000. But all the underlying topics can have their own versions of an assurance standard or some way of working towards something. GHG protocols is the example we've used, but there's plenty of other. It could be the ISO standards, the environmental health and safety, or sustainability, or any of those kind of topics. But there's others other than ISO. As a business, we obviously focus very much on the ISO standards, but there's other standards out there. Look for global standards as much as possible. It'll make your life easier, because if there are local standards, then they may be less applicable if someone's doing a more global assurance work, and they might have to redo work. And use accredited providers. That's the other big thing that we find often tricks people. They'll find providers who may be perfectly competent, but unless unless you can see that yourself as the assurance provider, unless you've got evidence of that, sometimes you might just have to do the work again, which again is not what anyone wants. So the more you can use accredited providers and get into those schemes, the easier it is for everyone else. So even though you might be saving some money on the initial work in the single topic, it might not save you money in the long term. Get a systems approach. So again, I'm a technology guy. I sort of help design and build the technology. I really struggle to see how people can do it without technology. There's just so much involved. Whether that's right from the beginning, from the materiality kind of assessment using technology, all the way through, you need the technology. And for the assurance point of view, it just makes life easier. We can start thinking about automating some of the assessments. We can start thinking about AI on some of the assessments. So there's a lot of things we can do to make our life easier, which then reduces the cost overall. But a lot of this is also making the company's own life easier. So that's really what we're aiming at, making sure that you think about systems. Then you can extract the data and give it to your assurance provider, or you can just give them access to the system. And more systems are like that, where they just say, you're an assurance provider, here's your access, you can read everything, you can ask questions, you can mark your findings, and that's the assurance done. You don't have to extract, you don't have document management issues. That's the way the world is working. So try and get involved in that. And lastly, almost from the beginning, plan things early. Have a good plan over your calendar year. You know your reporting dates generally. They'll generally be aligned with your financial dates. You're going to need more time than a financial audit takes today, even though I'm sure CFOs think their financial audits take far too long. Sustainability will take longer, just irrespective of how many material topics you need to do, just because, as I said, the controls aren't there, the processes aren't as mature as financial processes. We haven't been doing this as long. Things take longer. So you need to give yourself that time and not have to delay issuing a sustainability report because assurance hasn't been provided in good time. So think about that. Think about how to align it with finance where possible, but it's not always going to be possible if you're just not as mature as the financial world is. Okay, so we provide a lot of these systems. I know, hopefully people know who we are. We provide sustainability management systems. We provide audit solutions. We provide audits. We do audits. Come and talk to us if you've got any issues or questions about what we went through today. And then we have a bit of time for questions. Okay, I have a question here. I've mentioned that multiple assurance providers can potentially rely on work already performed. Is there reporting between assurance providers expected here to enable this reliance? So that's a good question. That depends on the outcome of the initial work. So again, using GHG protocol as the example, if the final if the initial report comes out and there's a finding which says this is limited assurance or reasonable assurance, and that is clear, so you've got everything in place. You've got an accredited provider. The scope is clear. The finding is clear, as in it's obvious what they mean. There's not really a lot of need to talk to the other providers. If those things aren't in place, then yes, there would be a need to discuss matters with the other providers, and then you'd be potentially using them as an input into yours, and you may need to go and talk to them. Obviously, the ideal situation is you don't need to do any of that because the report and the standards that are being used are well understood by everyone. That's probably some time off. I think we're still in the sort of feeling our way around stage with a lot of these areas. Maybe GHG protocol is probably one of the more mature areas because people have been doing it for a while. But it's basically the report assurance provider, so the CSRD report provider, who needs to make the decisions. Sometimes they'll be able to rely on someone else's report without talking to them. Sometimes they'll need to talk to them, and sometimes they'll just do it themselves because they just don't feel that there's enough value in going and talking to them, because that will take time as well, and they have a certain number of man days or man hours that they need to use to do their work. So we're still feeling our way through. The requirement, so the ISSA 5000 has some wording in there which tells you how you engage with other providers. So there is that expectation that might happen. But I really, certainly in our experience, where we've seen a report that we can rely on, we rely on it. If we don't, we generally would do it ourselves. Okay, so I think I've gone over time. Thank you all very much. As I said, please talk to me or get in touch. If you've got any further questions, I'd love to hear more. Thank you all very much for your time.